Hello there! In this video, we're going to look at what if Padme was a Sith. Now this is a suggestion from one of you guys, so if you want to see a video get made, put it in the comments, and hopefully I'll get round to making it. But without further ado, let's go! Now our story is going to start on Naboo, where a young Padme Amidala would be in the Naboo library. Maybe she would have a project for school or something, maybe she was there with her parents, but she would be bored and she would wander off to a section of the library that no one went to. Let's say a section about the history of chromium mining and refinement. There would be shelves and shelves of data cubes containing far more information about the mining and refinement of chromium than anyone would really need. But on one of these shelves, she would also see something else. A real book. She would be very intrigued because obviously she hadn't seen a real book, they don't really have them in Star Wars, and would begin to try and read it, but wouldn't get very far because it was in another alphabet. Now this other alphabet would actually be the ancient Sith alphabet, or ancient Sith script, but she didn't know that. Anyway, she would be intrigued by the book because it was a real book and would borrow it. No one was really using it anyway, it was in this forgotten part of the library. She would spend hours and hours of her free time translating the book in secret, and would slowly become obsessed with the Sith and their ideology. Before reading the book, she would have had a vague interest in politics, but as she began to read it, her interest would increase. She would begin to believe in the Sith way of thinking about power, control, and authority. As she grew older, she would become officially involved in politics, and would eventually become the Queen of Naboo. This book, however, wouldn't just talk about the ideology of the Sith, it would also talk about the Force and how to utilize it. And in her free time, she would begin to realize that she had some ability with the Force, and so would try and train her skills. And she would continue to do this and continue to slowly become more and more proficient with the Force. And one night, just before the events of the Phantom Menace, she would sneak out and go to train in one of the fields just outside of Theed. But in the field, she would see two figures in the distance. She would approach from a distance, making sure that they didn't see her, and as she did, the two would separate. She would decide to follow one of them, and she would end up following the figure all the way back into Theed, and actually into a back alley of Theed. She was intrigued by who these people were, and maybe she could find out. She hadn't really thought out exactly why she was following them, but when she turned into the alley, the figure would be waiting for her. The figure would ask why the Queen of Naboo was following people into dark alleys. She wouldn't know how to respond, but before she could even try to, she would feel her body gripped by something that felt like an invisible hand. She would begin to panic, but then she would realise that the figure must be using the Force on her. She had read about what it felt like to have the Force used on you in the book. She would recall what she had learned in her limited training, and she would try to fight against the grip, channeling her fear and anger, but it wouldn't seem to do anything. The figure would slowly walk towards Padme. She would wait for what she thought was her inevitable death, but suddenly the grip would release her, and the figure would begin to speak. The figure would comment that she was quite strong with the Force, and although they'd let go of her, she wouldn't be able to move due to sheer fear. The figure would then suddenly grip her again with the Force, and put her to sleep, like Kylo does to Rey in Episode 7, but Episode 7 won't happen because this is a what if video. And the last thing she would remember hearing was the figure saying, "Come with me, please." She would wake up in a cold office. The figure would begin to speak once again. The figure would say that she had two options: join him or die. After a pause, while Padme realised what was actually happening, she would ask who the figure was, and after another pause, while the figure decided whether to answer that question or not, he would respond, "I am Darth Plagueis." Padme would begin to laugh. She had dreamed of being a Sith, and now she'd just been asked to join one. After she and Plagueis had talked for a while, Padme would ask who Plagueis had been talking to earlier in the field. Plagueis would explain that it was his apprentice, who he believed was going to try and kill him. Sidious, which was his apprentice's name, had taken another apprentice of his own, called Maul, who he claimed was only an assassin, but Plagueis knew better. Plagueis knew that Sidious viewed Maul as a proper apprentice, and so Plagueis deduced that Sidious was going to try and kill him. However, Plagueis didn't think that Sidious was actually strong enough to defeat him in a fair fight, and so he also thought that Sidious was going to try and kill him in an underhand way. This would really defeat the point of the Rule of Two, where the master is defeated by the apprentice when the apprentice becomes stronger, and so the Sith becomes stronger over time. But Sidious had already proved to Plagueis that he didn't really care about the Rule of Two when he took another apprentice, Maul. So Plagueis would say that he therefore had come up with a plan. First he would say that he was constantly on alert for an attempt on his life. He wouldn't intend to stop Sidious, instead he wanted Sidious to think that he had killed his master, when he actually hadn't. So Plagueis had been mastering using the Force to make himself appear dead, basically shutting off all of his vital vital functions and living off the Force alone. Plagueis would also need a new apprentice to replace Palpatine, because Palpatine would think that Plagueis was dead, and also Palpatine wasn't really a very good Sith, and Plagueis wanted a new apprentice who was a better Sith, and that was where Padme came in. So Padme would begin to train with Plagueis, whilst also being Queen of Naboo. So the events of The Phantom Menace would actually happen like they do in the film, because Padme would keep her Sith identity a secret. Palpatine would plot and scheme and blockade Naboo, and shortly after the events of The Phantom Menace, he would try and kill his master. He would think he was successful when actually he wasn't, like Plagueis had planned for. Plagueis' plan would now allow Palpatine to continue to take control of the galaxy, to throw it into turmoil, and Plagueis' plan was then to take control of the galaxy from Palpatine when the galaxy was unstable enough to do so. Basically, let Palpatine do all the hard work and then just take all the glory at the end. And so galactic history would continue like it does in the films, and Plagueis would use Padme's position, now as a senator of Naboo, previously as a queen, to keep track of Palpatine's dealings. The two of them would both know who he was, and would watch as he manipulated the entire galaxy. Plagueis would also tell Padme to oppose Palpatine a lot in the Senate, in order to create a more volatile political climate. So when the two of them wanted to overthrow Palpatine, they could do, and it would be quite easy. As Padme watched Palpatine, she would also notice that he was taking an interest in a Padawan, Anakin Skywalker, the boy she'd met on Tatooine years before. Padme would know from the events of The Phantom Menace that the Jedi thought that Anakin was the chosen one. She could tell, because it was quite obvious, that Palpatine obviously wanted to take Anakin as his apprentice. This would be a bit of a concern, because she was worried that if Palpatine was successful, then with him and Anakin, the two of them would be too powerful to be overthrown. Therefore, she would want to get close to Anakin, so she could keep track of Palpatine's influence on him. She would use her connections to influence the Jedi Council to send Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker to defend her following a failed assassination attempt on her life, which she already actually knew about, and so placed Corday, her decoy, in her place. So the story would continue just as it does in the prequels. Padme, however, would be aware of the second attempt on her life, and would be prepared to defend herself against whatever the attempt may be. So episode 2 would happen as we know it. The motivations of the characters would be different, but it would be the same story. Padme would be keeping her identity as a Sith secret. But what about her and Anakin's relationship, I hear you ask? Well, she would be slightly concerned after the incident with the Tuscans on Tatooine that Palpatine could be successful in gaining Anakin as his apprentice. However, the incident would also intrigue Padme, because although having Anakin as an enemy wouldn't be good, if she could gain Anakin as an ally, a Sith ally, then the two of them would be unstoppable. Because although she agreed with most of the Sith ideals, the rule of two could often cause the apprentice to kill the master too early, like Palpatine tried to do on Plagueis. She hadn't worked out how to get around this problem before, but if she could get Anakin to join her, then they could work together to create the most powerful empire ruled by the Sith the galaxy had ever seen. So the whole of episode 2 would happen as we know it. Initially, Padme would only pretend to be in love with Anakin, but over time would actually develop some feelings for him. Fortunately, because they kept their relationship a secret, Plagueis wouldn't know about it. By the time of episode 3, Padme would actually love Anakin. She would be pregnant, just like in episode 3, and actually the events of episode 3 would happen just like they do until Anakin had become Darth Vader. This would happen largely due to the fact that Padme doesn't really see Anakin very much during the Revenge of the Sith, and so Padme wouldn't be there to stop Palpatine bringing Anakin to the dark side, and so she would have to change her plans a little bit, because she needed Anakin to join her, not Palpatine. Just like in Revenge of the Sith, Obi-Wan would go and tell Padme that Anakin had fallen to the dark side. Of course she already knew this, but she would pretend she didn't. He would sneak aboard her ship, and she would go to Mustafar to see Anakin. She would say that Obi-Wan had said that he'd turned to the dark side, and he would begin to respond and say that Obi-Wan was just trying to turn her against him. But this time, she would just smile. She would tell him that if Obi-Wan really wanted to turn her against him, he'd gone about it the complete wrong way. She would say to Anakin that she knew that the dark side was the only path to true power. He would start to ask her what she was talking about, and she would laugh and say that she knew the dark side more than he could ever imagine. Obi-Wan would still be inside the ship at this point, and would be listening. He would wisely decide not to confront them both, because that might be too much even for him. Although maybe if he climbed on top of the ship, he'd be okay. I don't know. That's not what he does in the story, though. After a long conversation between Padme and Anakin, where she revealed her true self to him and explained that there were actually two groups of Sith in the galaxy. There was her and Plagueis in one group, and there was Anakin, which was what she called him because she refused to call him Darth Vader, and also Sidious, which was the other group. And after this conversation, Anakin would join Padme and they would become a group. So now we have 3 groups. We have Plagueis on his own, but he doesn't know that yet. We have Sidious on his own, and he doesn't know that yet. And we have Padme and Anakin working together. Unfortunately for Padme, she would say that they couldn't take power immediately because she was rather pregnant. And so she would have to keep hiding her powers from the galaxy for a while until she'd given birth. They would agree that they should both return to Coruscant to avoid suspicion. She could give birth in a Galactic Republic medical facility, whilst Anakin, or Vader as Sidious knew him, would return to Sidious to avoid suspicion. And all this time, Obi-Wan would still be hiding in the ship, all the way back to Coruscant. And because he didn't fight Anakin, he would be back at Coruscant far earlier than if he'd fought Anakin. And so when he got to Coruscant, Yoda would have only just finished his duel with Palpatine. The 2 Jedi would regroup and they would descend into the lower levels of Coruscant to discuss their next move, to try and stay out of the way of the clones. Obi-Wan would explain about the now 3 groups of Sith: Plagueis, Sidious, and Anakin and Padme. Because Padme had spent a lot of time in the Senate with senators like Bail Organa and Mon Mothma, she would know which of them had sympathy for the Jedi. So she would tell Anakin, or as Sidious knew him, Vader, to tell Sidious to have these senators arrested to make sure that they were kept from aiding the Jedi, because the last thing she wanted was Jedi interference. So whilst Padme was giving birth and recovering from giving birth, Vader would be observing Palpatine as Palpatine established his empire, and Plagueis would be waiting for his chance to overthrow Palpatine. But Plagueis would be getting slightly concerned about the lack of communication from Padme. He was completely unaware that Padme had basically betrayed him at this point. Back in the lower levels of Coruscant, Yoda and Obi-Wan would hear talk of a man who had fallen from the sky. People were saying he was injured, but that he'd survived. They would know that only a Force user could survive a fall from such great heights. They would track down this Force user and discover it was a severely injured Mace Windu. We know that Obi-Wan has lots of contacts on Coruscant, and so he would take Mace to a doctor so Mace could recover. Meanwhile, Obi-Wan and Yoda would return to the upper levels of Coruscant to monitor the Sith and make plans on when they should make a move and who they should engage first out of the 3 groups of Sith. By this point, Padme would now be strong enough to take on Plagueis with Anakin's help. However, Plagueis at this point would have become suspicious enough of Padme's lack of communication that he would have begun to spy on her. He would now be aware of her and Anakin's plan to kill Plagueis and Palpatine individually. Plagueis would know that he was no match for Anakin and Padme at the same time, and so he would decide that the only thing he could do was to contact Palpatine and explain exactly what was happening. And so after a rather tense conversation, he and Palpatine would agree to form an alliance, although it would only be temporary, because obviously after they'd beaten Padme and Anakin, if they did, then they would probably both end up trying to kill each other. Because Plagueis was now fully aware of everything that was happening with Padme and Anakin and even Palpatine, he would know that Padme had given birth to twins, Luke and Leia, and so he would have them captured as a bargaining tool. So now Obi-Wan and Yoda would decide that they should go and confront Palpatine first. But when they reached his office, they would find him and Plagueis already engaged in a fight with Padme and Anakin. So now we have a 2v2v2 fight. Obi-Wan and Yoda versus Palpatine or Sidious and Plagueis versus Anakin and Padme. And it would be a reasonably even fight. However, Plagueis and Palpatine would eventually manage to knock down Anakin, as his ability with the dark side hadn't fully been established at this point. And Padme then would be open to be attacked by both of them and would also be knocked down. They would both be unable to fight, although they wouldn't have been killed at this point. And so now we just have a 2 versus 2, Obi-Wan and Yoda versus Plagueis and Sidious. Both Plagueis and Sidious would realise that Obi-Wan was probably the weaker Jedi, and so would attack him with Force Lightning. Yoda would use Tutor Menace to block the lightning, but wouldn't be able to hold back the sheer power of the 2 Sith. Just like he does to Palpatine in Revenge of the Sith, he would manage to knock them both back, temporarily stunning them, but during this time a large amount of lightning would also enter his body. So whilst Palpatine, or Sidious, Plagueis, Padme and Anakin were stunned, Obi-Wan would carry Yoda away, realising that he didn't really stand a chance against the 2 Sith on his own. Plagueis would get up, and Sidious, thinking that they'd been victorious, would go to kill Plagueis, kill his only competition that was left. But Plagueis would be ready, and he would kill Palpatine before Palpatine had the chance to kill him. Plagueis would then stand over the injured Padme and taunt her. He would say that he'd taken her children, and unfortunately for her, only one of them could be taken as his apprentice because of the rule of 2. So then he would pull up a hologram of the 2 children, and he would say to a figure on the hologram, kill the girl. At this, the hologram would cut off, but Padme would sense her daughter's death. At this, she would use all of her anger and hatred to choke Plagueis and kill him with the Force. Obi-Wan would return Yoda to Mace and the Doctor, but Yoda would say it was too late to save him. He would say that he would always be with them, more than they could know, and Yoda would die. Obi-Wan would tell Mace what had happened and that they had to escape now in the chaos following Palpatine's death, but Mace would refuse and say that the Jedi had to change quickly or the Order would become extinct permanently. So after a rather heated discussion, Obi-Wan would leave Mace on Coruscant and manage to escape the planet in the chaos following Palpatine's death, because the clones weren't hunting down Jedi at this point. Instead, they were reacting to reports of violence in the Senate building. And so that's where we'll leave the story. But first, what is the state of the galaxy at this point? Well, Obi-Wan would be touring the galaxy looking for Force-sensitive children to restart the Order. He would have help from Force Ghost Yoda, and he would obviously have to evade the Empire, whatever that might look like. Speaking of the Empire would be taken by force by Padme and Anakin, who would both rule together. The Sith would become the Skywalker and Padme lineage, just the family that stemmed from Anakin and Padme, because this would avoid selfishness, because there wouldn't be infighting within the family, there would be respect. There wasn't really one Sith in charge, or one Sith master. They were all deemed equal within the family. And on Coruscant, there would be a hooded figure who would go round helping people, opposing the Empire. And no one would know who this hooded figure was. It was a legend, like Batman is in the DC universe, a freedom fighter. But we would know that this figure was Mace Windu. And that's about it. That's how I see Star Wars going if Padme was a Sith. Now, if you enjoyed the video, remember to like it and subscribe to the channel and all that sort of stuff. Comment down below any what if videos that you'd like to see, or what you think would have happened later in the story, or how you would have taken the story, or anything else you want to tell me. But that's about it. Thanks for watching. Bye!